Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright, round your virgin mother and child. Holy infant, so tender and mild.
Well, good morning, everyone. I am thoroughly convinced that every family has got them. They're called the family historian. They're the one who has done all of the research of where the family had started and how it got here to the United States and all of the details. In my dad's family, it was my Uncle Max before he passed away. And in my mom's side of the family, it's my Uncle Marvin who has done all of the research. In fact, a couple years ago, Tara and I went to visit my folks in Arkansas, and my dad brought out the box, the box with all the pictures and all the documentation and family lineage and different things. Actually cool stuff. In fact, there's always those pictures with, you turn it over and it's a black and white picture, and it says, this is such and such, and this is such and such, and then there's a question mark. We just don't know who this person is. Do you realize that one day, if Jesus does not come back, people are going to be looking at pictures of us with a question mark of who in the world was that person right there? But it's interesting because you find out a little bit about your family. In fact, last time we were back, I got to reading some documentation, and my dad's mom, her maiden name was Funderburg. And actually, it originally was Funderburg, and they're from Germany. A pretty cool story that there's actually in Germany a Funderburg castle. So if I ever go to Germany, that's kind of on my bucket list. But evidently, on my dad's side of the family, there were two boys that they were very young when their dad, who was king of the castle or lord of the manor or whatever it was, he died, and they were rightful heirs to that. But there was an uncle that felt like it was his, and they actually ended up in South Carolina, for lack of a better term, as political refugees, fleeing for their lives so that they would not die, and they ended up here in America, and that's kind of a little bit of that side of the family tree. Another thing that happened years ago, my uncle shared this story, and it kind of morphed as it went along, but my mom's maiden name is Salzman, and they were able to trace that back to, we are direct descendants of a man by the name of Deacon John Adams. Actually, Deacon John Adams Sr. And there was one of his boys actually became a pretty big deal, like President of the United States, big deal, like that John Adams. But there was a couple of other sons. One was Elihu, actually died in 1775 of dysentery. That was actually a thing back then. But the middle son, who became a farmer in Massachusetts, was Peter Adams, and we're direct descendants of that. Now, if you have in your family line, if you studied it and you did the research, or somebody else did the research for you, you're going to find some pretty cool stories. You're going to find some things like, wow, I didn't know that. And so as your family gets together and you talk about where you've been, where you came from, those are the stories you're going to talk about. You know what you're not going to talk about? You're not going to talk about those things that are like pushed into the shadows. You're not going to talk about the physical abuse. You're not going to talk about drug addiction or sexual misconduct or criminal activity. That kind of stuff is not the stuff you're going to talk about. But it's interesting to me that in the book of Matthew, as God is guiding Matthew to write to the Jewish people, I don't know if you're aware of that, but the book of Matthew was specifically for the Jewish people to prove that Jesus was in fact the Messiah. Now, the way that one of the reasons, that one of the things that they had to do to prove that Jesus was who he was is to fit him in the right family. So they had to trace the family back to David and the family back to Abraham to make sure that that Jesus was in the right family tree. Now, with this, it's interesting that God includes people in the family tree of Jesus that are ordinarily people that we don't talk about. They're those stories that kind of get hidden. In fact, over the next 3 or 4 weeks, what we're going to do is we're going to dive into Matthew chapter 1. That's where we're going to be today. But we're going to dive into Matthew chapter 1. And the title of our series is Christmas. Okay? You get the mess in there? That Jesus' family tree is really messy. And there's a lot of people in there that you kind of think they don't deserve to be in there. So we're going to examine, but first of all, we're just going to start in the first 5 chapters. And in the first 5 chapters, or first chapters, no, we're not going to do that. First 5 verses, okay. Sorry, we'd be here a long time. But anyway, so the first 5 verses say this. It says, "This is the record of the ancestors of Jesus, the Messiah, a descendant of David," again, connecting to David, "and of Abraham," connecting to Abraham. She goes back to Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Amminadab. Amminadab was father of Nahshon. Nahshon was father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed was the father of Jesse. I want to stop here today, and as we kind of dive into the family tree of Jesus, notice that most of the time it simply says father of and father of and father of, but they're in parentheses, and this actually happens 4 times. We're going to look at the first 3 here today. In parentheses, it says whose mother was. And it includes specific women in the family tree of Jesus. And in their own right and in their own stories, these are a little bit messy. So you go back to verse 3, and in verse 3 it says that Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Now, you think no big deal until you go back to Genesis chapter 38 and you understand the story. You see, Judah was one of Jacob's sons, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And Judah had 3 sons. His first son was Ur. Ur married Tamar. But before they could have a child, Ur died. Now, in ancient times, and this sounds a little bit weird to us, there was a thing called Levirate marriage. And Levirate marriage was such that if the oldest son, he dies before there is an heir, the next son in line, or sometimes the next family member in line, steps in, and they become the husband and provide, like the older brother, basically an heir, a descendant in that way. So next in line was Onan. And Onan was like, I don't want to do this. And so Onan dies. So Ur has died and Onan has died. Judah had one other son, and he's thinking, Tamar is the kiss of death for my boys. And so he was not going to allow his youngest son to marry Tamar. And so Tamar was kind of beginning to think like, hey, I'm getting ghosted by this guy. Nothing's happening. So she disguises herself as a prostitute. And as she disguises herself as a prostitute, Judah walks by and he propositions her and agrees to pay her a goat. Okay? But he doesn't have a goat with him. And so she says, what are you going to give me kind of as like security that you're going to give me a goat? And this is great. He says, here's my walking stick and here's my signet cord. Now, basically, it was probably something he wore around his neck, but it was like a signature specifically to him. I'll just say it this way in our terms. He says, "How about you hold on to my driver's license?" And so he gives his identification to her. She becomes pregnant, of all things, with twins. It gets back to Judah, and Judah is ticked. He's like, she needs to be stoned. This is bad stuff. So he goes and is about ready to take her life, and she says, "Oh, by the way, who do these belong to?" And that's when Judah realizes, oh no, I'm the dad here. She's the righteous one. But I'm thinking about this story. This story is in the family tree of Jesus. This story is messy. All right, these are the kinds of stories we don't talk about if they're in our family tree. And I'm thinking, as I'm reading along with this, there were 11 other brothers. Why did God choose Judah and not one of them? I mean, because clearly Judah doesn't measure up. But God does that and chooses for Jesus to come from the line of Judah. We get into verse 5, and it says, Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Now, you go back to Joshua chapter 2. We've been in Exodus for most of the fall, and the Exodus is over. The wandering is over. They're now getting ready to conquer the land. Joshua sends out 2 spies to Jericho. Those spies, while they go in Jericho, probably the right thing to do to kind of camouflage themselves. They visit the local prostitute. And as they're there, she begins to say that, listen, we're terrified. We know that God has given you this land. She hides the spies. She helps the spies escape. And she just asks for protection whenever God comes and his people conquer Jericho. Actually, she acts in faith. And I think God was stirring and moving in her life the entire time. But the fact of the matter is, she trafficked herself. The fact of the matter is she was an outsider, but God chose to put a spotlight on her being in Jesus' family lineage. While there's good stuff here, this is still kind of messy. But after this, we read a story about Ruth, where it says, Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Honestly, this is one of the most beautiful stories in the entire Bible. You find that because of famine in Israel, Naomi with her husband and her 2 sons, they end up in Moab because of survival. And while they're there, they find Moabite women to marry. But in the course of time, Naomi's husband passes away, her sons pass away, and she chooses to go back to Israel. But as she's going back to Israel, she offers to her daughters-in-law that y'all need to stay here. I have nothing to give you. And one goes back, but Ruth says, no, it's that beautiful line that your people will be my people and your God will be my God. She does an amazing thing. And through that, she comes in contact with Boaz, who is, again, Levirate marriage. She marries Boaz and she has a child, and she gets to be the great-grandmother of King David. I mean, how cool is that? And you think, this is a pretty neat story. It's kind of a tidy story. It's kind of like, it's not as messy as the other stories. But Ruth was a Moabite. And if you kind of do the research and look into her family tree, it's pretty sketchy. Not pretty sketchy, it's really sketchy. You see, you go back to Genesis chapter 19, and in Genesis chapter 19, you find that God is about ready to annihilate Sodom and Gomorrah for their sin, for their evil, and for their immorality. But Abraham's nephew Lot lived in Sodom, and through the course of conversation with God, he's like, okay, I'm going to let Lot leave before I destroy this thing, but they got to go when they got to go. And the angels show up to get Lot, and while the angels are in Lot's house, people are knocking on the door, men are knocking on the door, they want to have sex with the angels. And so Lot, being the good dad that he was, says, have my daughters instead. father of the year right there. Right? And so the next morning they leave. We know the story that Lot's wife turned around as the fire and brimstone was coming down from heaven. She turned into a pillar of salt. And it was just Lot and his daughters. And what we find in Genesis chapter 19, verse 32, is the conversation between the two daughters. Come, let's get him drunk with wine. Then we will have sex with him. That way we will preserve our family line through our father. Reading on in verse 36 and 37, it says, as a result, both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their own father. When the older daughter gave birth to a son, she named him Moab. He became the ancestor of the nation now known as the Moabites. This is a nation that started from incest. Okay, so that's the family tree. That's the lineage. And I know that God's people would always look at the Moabites and go, you know, they are Moabites. Yet God invited Ruth, despite her family's past, to be part of his nation and the family line of his son. Listen, these are messy stories. No way around it. When you look at these stories, and we've kind of glossed over them in our world today, but they are messy. And the thing about it is, like us, if it's us and this is part of our family tree, what we do with these is we don't talk about them. We definitely don't go public with them. We might have those side conversations, but it's not those out front and common conversations that we have. All of these women were outsiders. All of them came with a certain amount of baggage. You got one who acted immorally, albeit out of self-preservation, but it revealed not just like her, but it even more revealed the immorality and evil of Judah. You have one who trafficked herself. You have another one who, albeit acted in great faith. She comes from a family, and she comes from a nation that its beginnings were not the beginnings that they talked about when they all got together. Now, why does God specifically mention these? Why does he specifically mention these stories, these examples? And these are the only ones that actually kind of get a little spotlight. Now, I'm going to suggest here today that what we find here is the pre-gospel gospel. What we find here is, I'm going to say, some important gospel truths that when we look at these truths, we have to really understand that they're relevant for us. They're relevant for you and I. In fact, the very first thing that I want to say here today is this: God's grace is bigger than my past. Let me go ahead and say that again. God's grace is bigger than my past. Now, I'm going to say that every single one of us has something in our life, either past or present, that is messy. We have something that, like, if we were in the family line of Jesus, people would look at us and they would say, how did they make it in? How did they make it into the family line of Jesus? It might be financial stuff that lacked integrity and honesty. It might be drug abuse or alcohol abuse that led to ungodly behavior. It might be sexual sin that damaged relationships. It might be criminal stuff that left a lot of collateral damage. It might be stuff that only you and God know. And you're thinking, I just want to keep it this way. All of us have something that is messy. All of us have something that, again, if we were part of Jesus' family tree, people would be like, I don't like that part of the story. But I think one of the things that we can look at is God spotlighting these examples is not so much spotlighting the mess, but spotlighting His grace. Putting the onus on Him and how great and awesome His grace is. In fact, I always think about Ephesians chapter 2, because Ephesians chapter 2 gives us an incredible picture of our spiritual lineage. In fact, if you have your Bibles, I'm going to be there today, and I'm going to start with verse 1 of Ephesians 2. It says, "Once you were dead because of your disobedience and your many sins." We have to realize that life outside of Jesus is spiritual death. There's no way to gloss over this. Life outside of Jesus means that we are in a state of spiritual death. You used to live in sin just like the rest of the world, obeying the devil, the commander of the powers of the unseen world. He is the spirit at work in the hearts of those who refuse to obey God. All of us used to live that way. Some may do that right now, following the passionate desires and inclinations of sinful nature. By our very nature, we were subject to God's anger just like everyone else. This is our spiritual lineage. This is our spiritual family tree, that all of us pre-Jesus were dead in our sins. But then you get to verse 4. I love verse 4. In fact, the first two words of verse 4 might be some of the most important words in the entire Bible, but God. So this is God's story, not ours. This is God's, His goodness, His grace, His love, not ours. But God is so rich in mercy, and He loved us so much that even though we were dead because of our sins, He gave us life when He raised Christ from the dead. It is only by God's grace that you have been saved. Grace is receiving what we do not deserve. And again, but God. And God gave us life, not because we did anything good, but because He raised Jesus from the dead. Here's something that we all need to know and understand. Grace isn't offered because we're awesome. It's offered because we're not. We don't get to be the hero of this story. A lot of times when we tell our spiritual story, even after we have come to Jesus, it's a whole lot of us and a little bit of Jesus. But we have to understand, we made the mess, Jesus cleaned it up through His grace. That's the story. Jesus gets to be the hero of this story. But there's something else that I want to explore here this morning, especially as we think about Ruth and we think about Ruth's family history that was so marred and actually began as an actual family in some pretty icky sort of stuff. And it's this right here. God's grace is bigger than my family's past. John Mark Comer, author of a book called Practicing the Way. In that book, he talks about different categories of sin. One that you may have heard before are sins of omission. These are sins that we do that we don't even realize that we're doing them. That's sin of omission. There's sin of commission. In other words, that we know that they're sin and we end up doing them anyway. But he also talks about attachment sins. And attachment sins are, let's go ahead and say, the reason behind both the sins of omission and commission. These are the patterns and rhythms that have been developed in our lives that are kind of beneath the surface. They're the why we do what we do sort of sins. Now, with this, I want to point to family. In fact, I've got a friend who is a licensed counselor. His name is Tom Caffrey. Tom used to practice here in Albuquerque. He's now in St. Louis. But I asked Tom one time, I said, listen, I kind of stink at this. I really am not a great counselor. What are some tools that you can give me? And he said, me. You can send them to me, which is really kind of a good thing. But then he said, always remember when you're dealing with people, these three letters and what they mean. It is FOO, family of origin. In other words, sometimes people are how they are and do what they do because of the family that they come from. In fact, I grew up in a small town in western Kansas, less than 800 people. And one of the joys of growing up was listening to the old-timers talk. Loved hearing stories, loved hearing people talk about what it used to be like, decades ago. But I can tell you that there was something that I heard all the time as some of the old-timers would talk about some of the young guys. And they would say, well, you know why he is the way he is. he's a, and then you fill in the last name. In other words, your family heritage, who you came from, who your dad was, who your mom was, who your grandpa was, that identified who you were and why you are the way you are. In the Bible, we would call this generational curse. There are things that we do, good, bad, and indifferent, that are like stamp from those who came before us. Like, I'm a dad and a granddad. And listen, I've realized this for 30 years now, because my oldest is 30. I'm not old enough to have a kid that's 30, but the reality is I have listened to words come out of my mouth as a dad and a grandpa, and I realize, oh my goodness, that is Dale Schaefer coming out. And a lot of times it's good stuff, but it's the reality. We are, and we develop attachments, and we develop patterns, and we develop motivations. But here's the cool thing, and this is our bottom line here for today, is this: God's grace writes better stories. God took Tamar and included the stuff that should have been excluded, but His grace wrote a better story. God took a woman who trafficked herself for the pleasure of men, and He wrote her into His Son's story. And He took a woman who acted honorably and nobly and in great faith, but came from a family that had a checkered past, and allowed her to be the great-grandmother of King David. And here's one of the realities that I will also say today. God's grace is still writing better stories. So this was not in my notes, and I included it in my last message, so I'm going to go ahead and include this again. I've heard some stories about my dad's childhood. And I can remember about 23, 24 years ago, Dad opened up like he had never opened up before about some of the stories in his life. And one of the things that I'll just say is the abuse, the pattern of abuse and amount of abuse that he endured in his childhood and in his teen years, that if this had been the 1980s and beyond, he probably would have been taken out of his home and probably would have made Oprah or Dr. Phil. It's pretty crazy stuff. That's the family he came from. But I'm going to tell you that there was something that rewrote his story. Before I was born, there were two local football coaches that one day knocked on my mom and dad's door and invited them to church. My dad met Jesus. His grace, Jesus' grace, rewrote his story, and thankfully rewrote my story, and hopefully the story of my kids and their kids and their kids. I am thoroughly convinced, because I've seen this, God's grace is still writing better stories. Part of church, part of the beauty of church, is that we get to be around people and God is rewriting their story for the better. And we get to walk alongside people and encourage people that are on a similar journey as ours, that we have to realize that even good lives are messy, but they're certainly not as messy as they could have been without Jesus. And so as we go to our head, heart, and hands challenge here today, one of the things I want to challenge you with this is confess your mess. Again, I'll even go as far as to say that even good lives have moments of messy. And sometimes we think that if we do all the right things and that we just make sure that we insulate ourselves, then all is going to be right. But the reality is we can't control the mess that is sometimes visited upon us. So I would just challenge you here today is just confess your mess, name your mess. And it may be something that is something that you've brought on. It may be the result of somebody else bringing mess into your life, but name that mess. Also, I want to challenge you with this here today. In fact, I changed this morning based on something I read last night and then again this morning. I initially had down as our heart is turn to Jesus. But instead, I want to throw out this surrender to Jesus. I actually read Colossians chapter 3, verse 15, where it talks about let us allow the peace of Christ to rule our hearts. And so this is a collective thing. It's us together. We do this. But the word rule the heart here, is to allow someone to be autocratically in control of your life. In fact, it pointed to the action of an umpire who in the Greco-Roman games had absolute say. And so you can't allow Jesus to rule in your heart without first surrendering to him. And that hit me because I had to dig deep, and I had to ask the question, am I living truly a surrendered life? Am I inviting Jesus along for the ride? Or am I surrendering to him? So I'm going to just say surrender to Jesus. But also, finally, with your hands, develop better rhythms. I don't know about you, but I can point to my own life. And one of the things that I realize is that healthy rhythms, right rhythms, point to and lead to a healthy walk with Jesus. When my rhythms are off and when they're wonky, my relationship with Jesus is fuzzy. It's there, but it's something's just not right in that. And so I want to encourage you to develop healthy rhythms. In fact, I don't want this to be a plug, but this is very much a plug. There's actually a journey called the Rooted Experience that has been used by thousands of churches in the United States since 2008. In fact, in 2008, there was a group of church leaders from Mariners Church in California that went to Kenya. And what they experienced in a local church there was something that the local church called Mzizi, which is a Swahili for roots or rooted. You go to Colossians 2, being rooted and founded in Jesus. But this rooted journey, this rooted experience that this American church experienced in Africa was a church that was exploring rhythms that are rhythms of discipleship. They're spiritual rhythms that we find in Jesus, but we also find in the early church. And they were helping people within their local church develop these rhythms and come back to the United States, and they together with the church in Kenya developed this. And I was going to share with you that in January next month, 2026, near the end of the month, we're going to begin the Rooted Experience here at Valley View. We're asking our small groups that are already meeting together that they will dive into this this spiritual journey, spiritual rhythm journey, but we're also opening it up. In fact, in your little tap to connect thing, there is you connect on that. Right under baptism, it says Rooted, and you can sign up for that. And listen, I know that this is a big dream, and it may be an unrealistic dream, but I hope and I pray that in the next 3 to 5 years, every student, because there's a student-rooted experience, and every student and adult here at Valley View will go through this journey, because this journey ultimately guides us along the rhythms of Jesus and will counter those attachment rhythms, those other rhythms that are so unhealthy in our lives, and will write a better story. Will you join me in prayer?